Welcome. Thank you for being here. You know what I was thinking about you coming? I thought you couldn't have dragged your predecessor here in his pickup truck. Why are you here?
Well, you know, I have to tell you, maybe people don't know this, but I started, my very first project that I wrote was environmental indicators for Canada and the United States. So I began my career in public policy on the environmental side, on the conservation side. My first advocacy job was landowner advocacy for the Canadian Property Rights Research Institute, where I learned a little bit. So that's where I first learned about the problem that we had of orphan and inactive wells and what we needed to do about it. And then when I worked at the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, I also authored an environmental survey on attitudes that business have. They don't believe that there is a choice that you make between the economy and the environment. They believe you could do both. So I would say that this strain of doing research on how do energy and environment intersect has really been the foundation of my public policy career. We don't always agree. I don't always agree with Chris, but I always love talking to him to get his perspective.
Excellent. Well, as you'll see, suddenly you draw a crowd, and isn't that great? We have lots to talk about and not loads of time. So, a net zero by 2050, we have the grid to talk about, we have the renewable pause to talk about, we have peak oil, when is it ever going to happen, if at all, and COP to talk about. We have 5 things. Anything you want to start with?
Well, let me talk about net zero by 2050, because when I first heard that Europe was moving in that direction, I thought, we can do that. And so I spent quite a bit of time with with various conservative think tanks and conservative groups to try to get that message out about let's embrace this challenge. Because one of the things conservatives have always said is that we have to wait for the technology to develop. We have to wait for innovation to happen. We have to let this be industry-led. And what I was observing is that industry was leading. In the past 5 years, for instance, you can look at the Pathways Project, which developed a very ambitious plan to be net zero by 2050. You can look at the petrochemical incentive program that we put in place that has attracted Air Products, a net zero hydrogen facility. Dow Chemical is nearing the end of making its final investment decision on a net zero petrochemical project. Heidelberg intends to have a net zero cement plant in Edmonton next year. And so it seemed to me that we needed to bring our policy in alignment with where industry was and then work with the federal government to try to align around what the pathway would be to 2050. We're not having perfect success on that. We are having some success. It's not all a fight, but I think that we're at least heading in the right direction.
There are folks in here who run businesses, and I do not know of a business that has a 27-year business plan. I actually don't know very many businesses that have a 5-year business plan. So I would like to ask you, when the emissions reduction energy development plan came out, it was positioned 6 months ago as a work in progress. How's progress? What can people look forward to happening this week, next week, and in the next 6 months? Well,
I guess I look at it a little bit differently. I think that, in fact, businesses do have a 20 and 40 and 60 and 100-year time frame. I know that, for instance, PV Mart does. They have a 100-year plan for where they want to be 100 years from now. I think what happens is that politicians have a 4-year time frame. And so politicians want to accelerate decision-making so that they can stand at podiums and have election wins, whether or not it's practical and realistic. And I've been watching this, as I mentioned. I've been following the COP discussions since the Kyoto in 1997, and I observed it happen over and over again. Politicians go out and they make these grand targets for what emissions reduction they're going to achieve, and then they don't achieve it. And so at the next COP meeting, they set new ambitious emissions reductions targets, and then they don't achieve them. And I guess I've taken a bit of a different view. I believe 2050 is achievable. I think that aligns us with most of our trading partners. Europe is on board with that. South Africa is as well. China, incidentally, wants to go to 2060. India wants to go to 2070. So I think that 2050 is realistic. And I think that you have to make sure that you are in sync with what is practical, what is achievable. There's not much point in putting forward a target that is unachievable and then being angry when it doesn't get achieved. Why don't we put forward a target that is reasonable? So I can tell you why 2030 is not achievable. Because everybody is kind of geared around how are we going to make massive emissions reductions by 2030. So part of the reason for our province, why it's difficult, is because we've already had a massive emissions reduction that came from the conversion from coal to natural gas. We have a brand new gas fleet they have when businesses make that kind of investment, they expect to have a time horizon for capital that is going to allow them to pay it back. It is typically around 40 years. And so that's part of the difficulty that we have now, is now the rules have changed and they want to add additional costs associated with that to get to net zero by 2035 on the power grid.
But even still, what are we doing in the next 6 months?
In the next, well, I can't build a carbon capture pipeline in 6 months. I can't roll out small modular nuclear in 6 months. I can't create direct air capture at 100 different sites in 6 months. That's what I'm saying, is that I believe 2050 is achievable because we will do all of those things. When I look at the Pathways project, for instance, it involves getting the agreement between federal and provincial government on investment tax credit that will create the incentive for them to build that carbon trunk line. Now, how long do you think it'll take to build a brand new pipeline down the eastern part of the province that I think is going to be 200 or 300 kilometers? That can't be done overnight. That's probably a several-year project. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is waiting for the Darlington small modular nuclear to roll out. I think New Brunswick is on track for 2026 with theirs. It's quite small. I think that Darlington's on track for 2028, and we have signed on to an MOU with our partners once that technology is there for us to work on rolling it out. In fact, we have a $7 million research grant that we gave to Synovus about how we might deploy that. But that can't be done in 6 months, and it can't be done before 2030. And then the last piece is direct air capture, which I am very excited about, because we have an innovative company called Avatar Innovations. They have two finalists in the Carbon X Prize that Elon Musk has put up for $100 million. We've already had an early success. Carbon Engineering was bought for $1.2 billion by Occidental Petroleum, and they have 100 sites that they're intending to roll it out. But none of that can happen in 6 months or by 2030. A lot of that might be 2035, might be 2040, might be 2045. That's why we have to have the longer time horizon.
The projects take a long time, but things can happen, policy can happen today, encouragement can happen today, funding can happen today, and I think a lot of folks in the room are curious about, deadlines or not, what are we actually doing now? What is happening now in the government level?
There's a number of things. I mean, I think that one of the things that we are not given enough credit for is that we have always been a leader on environmental policy. We have had successive climate plans. I think we've written 5 climate plans over the tenure of government through different administrations. We were the first to invest a massive amount in carbon capture utilization and storage. I didn't agree with the approach at the time, but it turned out to be quite visionary to have invested a substantial amount of money with Shell Quest so that we actually have at-scale projects that are now sequestering CO2, 10 megatons. We also phased out coal to natural gas, which has resulted in a massive reduction in emissions there. We set a target for methane emissions reductions to be 45% down from 2014 levels by 2025. We've achieved that, so we have to set a new one. We were the first to do industrial pricing of carbon through what is now our TIER program. TIER has just been approved last year by the federal government as being in sync with their proposals. So we've also started the hydrogen hub. I was just in Edmonton yesterday launching their new hydrogen buses. So Edmonton has one on the road and Strathcona County has one on the road. And they have an intention in the Edmonton region to be the hydrogen hub. We've been supporting that through Emissions Reduction Alberta. We've been supporting that through Innovate Alberta. We are supporting, along with the federal government, the conversion of long-haul vehicles so that they can either be dual fuel or full hydrogen, so that we can build this hydrogen highway starting between Calgary and Edmonton for long-haul vehicles, and seeing how we might be able to roll that out further. The Edmonton International Airport bought 100 Toyota Mirai. I got a chance to drive a hydrogen vehicle last summer. They're very zippy, and the economics on it seem to make sense. I mean, the Mirai sells for about $40,000 to $70,000, which is kind of what it is for a car these days. It's 5 kilograms to be able to fill up, which costs about $40 to $50, and it goes about 700 kilometers. So we're now at a point where I think that is going to be a massive new driver for how we're developing our technology here and how we're developing a cleaner transportation grid too.
In the world of, and I should, and folks know this.
Can I just say one more? I mean,
but again, the concern is it's not about what are the projects, it's what is the government doing? There's a lot of great projects going on, but what can you say? All right, this is what we're doing and what we plan, I think, is the question.
Well, I guess the reason I mention all of those is that government has had a part in being a catalyst for all of them, that we are helping to support hundreds of different projects, because in the world of innovation, you never know which one is going to be the one that succeeds. Look at, for instance, yesterday, Ever Technology. So it's a geothermal company that just got an award in Germany. We've supported them, but the federal government just put $90 million in for them to be able to accelerate. So that's the thing, is that it's incremental changes on incremental technology that add up to a major reduction in emissions. So if you're wondering what we're doing now, that's what we're doing now, and all of those things are going to lend themselves to major emissions reduction and ultimately achieving net zero by 2050.
Do you have targets you want to hit, say, by the end of your first term?
No, I don't, because I understand from the industry's perspective the things they need to do. I've talked about pathways. It's a similar arc for Capital Power. Capital Power says that they can have their their facilities net zero by 2045, and part of their proposal is also direct air capture, building out, carbon capture, utilization and storage, plus nuclear, plus building in renewables, plus doing direct air capture. And it's the same thing. All of those things take time to do. But I think you should be encouraged that every major industrial operation has a 2050 target, and if they can achieve it earlier, they will. But some of that is governments getting out of their way. A lot of the problem that we have in getting projects approved is that there's a regulatory morass to try to navigate through, federal versus provincial. Who has the ability to say yes? Everybody seems to have the ability to say no, but it's not a clear pathway to getting through to yes. So I think that we can accelerate that, but the federal and provincial government has to be in sync. Who is the final decision maker, and can we get to yes on some of these projects?
It feels to me, as a story guy, it's what I do, that there's two stories that play well in Alberta. It doesn't matter what event I'm at, it doesn't matter what I do. If I get up and I say, those dingbats in Ottawa, everyone claps. And if I say, can do Alberta spirit, everyone claps. And those are two big themes, and I think the dingbats in Ottawa, and apologies to the minister in the room, we'll get to that, but I do think Alberta sometimes justifiably can say that Ottawa has not spent a lot of time or interest making sure things were great for Alberta as much as they could have, and there's a long history of that. I was a little surprised at the pause, because it seemed to me to focus on one story, which is those dingbats in Ottawa story, as opposed to the entrepreneur, we don't have a status quo, if you have an idea, we'll go in Alberta. And what that does is, for the entrepreneurs who live and grew up and work here, they're the ones going to farms and saying, hey, we're thinking about solar, and these local people who have great ideas for businesses are being said, are you one of them Trudeau people? You're the one trying to get it all good at blackouts. And they're like, no, I live here, I work here, I want to start a company and a business here. And did not, the pause as it attacks Ottawa ends up affecting a lot of local businesses.
It may have been characterized that way, but that's not how we characterized it when we announced the pause. One of the things to understand about where we find ourselves in our market is that in the last year, we have had 8 level 3 alerts on our power grid. So that means it was near failure. Now, in the past, that used to be very intermittent and very infrequent. I think we would have 1 of those types of alert every year or 2. To have 8 in a year means that we have instability on our grid. And part of the reason we have instability on our grid is that we don't have enough reliable baseload power. And so when you're at the max, and we use 12,000 megawatts when we're at our max, whether it's because all of our air conditioning is on in plus 30 or all of our furnaces and lights are on because it's minus 30, if we don't have the ability to have dispatchable power, wind and solar, then we end up with those problems. So right now, I can tell you 2 of those incidents where our grid almost failed. We've got 5,000 megawatts of installed wind and solar. On those 2 days combined, they were generating 100 megawatts. And so what we have to be aware of is that when we bring on wind and solar, we have to have a backup. We always have to be able to keep the lights on in the most extreme situation. So that was one of the concerns. The other concern is that I represent a rural riding, and when I'm out traveling and I hear stories like we had to stop and re-engineer the Oyen airport because we couldn't bring in fixed-wing medevac services to be able to transport critical patients because they built a wind turbine too close to the runway, that's a problem. When I hear from another of my constituents that they're now having their operations interfered with because they can't spray because wind turbines were built too close to her property, that's a problem. And when I hear stories that there's prime agriculture land that is being covered over with solar panels, that's a problem. So those are the kind of things that we're trying to solve, is where do we site wind and solar so it doesn't end up impairing other people's property rights? Where do we site solar in particular so that we can continue to see it built out on site? I mean, there's no pause, as Minister and I were talking about, there's no pause on if you want to put solar on an on-site property for your own use. I know that in West Edmonton Mall, the Gramesians are interested in doing that. Lethbridge Expo Centre, they built it with the idea of putting solar on. There are examples all over town of that. We want to encourage that type of development, but we need to be mindful that we have a historic problem with oil and gas sites that have not been cleaned up, going all the way back to the 50s and 60s. I started by saying that that's kind of where I began my career in public policy. So why would we want to potentially create another problem in the future of not having money set aside in some kind of sinking fund so that these projects can also be cleared when they come to the end of their natural life? I talked to somebody who gave me an estimate on how much it would cost to reclaim an existing wind turbine. It's like 850 cubic meters of cement. It's a tower the size of the Calgary Tower. It's the blades that have to be taken away and buried. It's at least a minimum of $1 million for reclamation for each one of those sites. Some of these farms have 50 turbines. So is anyone putting aside $50 million to make sure that the landowner isn't stuck with that cost? Those are the things that I am worried about. I don't want somebody 20 years from now saying, didn't you guys learn from oil and gas? Why did you allow the same thing to happen here? So we have to have consistent policy. So then the pause ends March? February 20th. And you notice I didn't say anything about the federal government when I gave my answer, but it has been depicted that way, and the federal government have taken it that way. But we've got serious issues with our power grid. I think it's because at the same time, we have federal environment minister Stephen Guilbeault trying to tell us that we have to be net zero on our power grid by 2035, putting in very unrealistic expectations for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, it must be said, because they have to be abated to a level of 95%. Right now, the technology is about 65%. The folks in the industry I talk to think we can get to 80%. But no one is going to invest now to get to 95% with the fingers crossed, hoping it will happen when they say they're going to use the criminal law power to either put them in jail or give them fines. No one's going to do it. So that's the problem, the battle that we're having right now, is can we stretch this out to 2050, work together so that we can make sure that we're pacing this so that we can all achieve the target we're looking for.
Do you think that there is not people in the room or people in Alberta, there are not engineers and entrepreneurs and investors, if we said to them, let's get at this, this is 12 years away we're arguing about. Isn't there an amazing amount that can happen in the next 12 years?
There is an amazing amount that can happen in the next 12 years, but the problem is that if you put such punitive measures in place at 2035, you scare investment away now. If you say 2050, we'll work with you, best effort, let's figure out the pathway to get there. You've got two levels of government from different political parties agreeing on that path. That creates uncertainty. Or that creates certainty. What creates uncertainty is if we have two levels of government with different targets, and then you're also throwing the criminal law power on top of it. That's why we're at the table with the federal government right now. I've got 10 deputy ministers and department officials. They have 10 deputy ministers and department officials. We've met, I think, 4 or 5 times. And so we are finding some common ground. I think small modular nuclear we will find some common ground on. I know for sure hydrogen we will find common ground on because Minister Wilkinson drives a hydrogen vehicle. So I know we will be able to build that out. We are jointly funding some of our net zero projects like Air Products and Dow Petrochemical. So there are lots of ways in which we'll be able to find common ground. I'd love to talk to them more about interties with British Columbia and Manitoba and what they might be able to do to assist us in fast-tracking that. But I think we have to be in alignment on what the end target is, and that's not quite where we're in alignment yet.
I was surprised to hear the word impossible used, honestly, and it's not. I'm not a policy person, nor am I a genius in much except hanging out. But when it comes to this, I thought when we say this is impossible, 12 years seems, that could be 4 premiers from now. To say that's impossible, that's a pretty strong word to use about our own ability in Alberta to make things happen.
You know, look, I mean, we would have to build 4 hydroelectric dams the size of Churchill Falls by 2035 to be net zero. So does anyone think it would be possible to get all of the siting decisions, the regulatory, the First Nations, the different levels of landowner consultation, the environmental issues? Does anyone think that would be possible to get that built in 12 years, starting now? I mean, you go ahead and talk to Jonathan Wilkinson then, because I can tell you, Site C began in 1954. Site C began in 1954. Fine. Do you think I can get? Do you think I can get an equivalent amount of nuclear rolled out in 12 years? Do you think I could do that in an environment that we've never had nuclear before?
I don't want to interrupt the two of you. But
do you what do you know?
And I get. And I.
What do you know that my industry experts don't know about? Yeah. Well, you know, and what do I do when there's no sun and there's no wind? Batteries, let's talk about batteries, Danielle, because I've talked to somebody. I want to talk about batteries for a minute, because I know that everybody thinks that this economy is going to be operated on wind and solar and battery power, and it cannot. There is no industrialized economy in the world operating that way, because they need base load. And I'll tell you what I know about batteries, because I talked to somebody who was thinking of investing in it on a 200 megawatt plant. $1 million to be able to get each megawatt stored. That's $200 million for his plant alone, and he would get 1 hour of storage. So if you want me to have 12,000 megawatts of storage, that's $12 billion for 1 hour of storage, $24 billion for 2 hours of storage, $36 billion for 3 hours of storage. And there are long stretches in winter where we can go weeks without wind or solar. That is the reason why we need legitimate, real solutions that rely on base load power rather than fantasy thinking. And I am not going to engage in fantasy thinking and say something is possible when I know that my principal job...
I think we need to stop.
My principal job is to have a reliable energy grid. That's what I'm trying to do.
I think I understand... that got interesting, didn't it? But it's important, and these are important conversations, and it's not like we're all going to come to some sort of thing in the next 3 minutes, and I understand that. However, I do think of examples in Alberta. I look at when Peter Lougheed went in and funded the oil sands. He had incredible opposition from the conventional oil people who said this is an attack on our way of doing it. And he said, we've got 12 years to figure this out because conventional oil is gone. Now, that prediction wasn't right, but he inspired a whole province, and that's where SAGD came out of. All of these engineers did incredible work, and they made an entire industry occur. And I feel like we're at the cusp now, and to argue with Ottawa, when really we're not arguing with Ottawa, we're arguing with the world. We need to find a way forward. Is there not something that we can say we're going to take a step in that direction? Net
zero by 2050. We are all in alignment on net zero by 2050. We have our industry in alignment. I'm in agreement with our major trading partners. I think what we have to do, though, is focus on the areas where we agree. I mean, that wasn't a policy before I came in. It was not a policy of our government to be net zero by 2050. So we have brought our entire populace on board, our province on board, my caucus on board, our members on board, with the notion that we can be aligned with the federal government on a 2050 target. But you can't then just say, oh, well, we got you at 2050, now we want you to do 2030. That's not reasonable. What is reasonable is working with us on what we think is going to be a pathway that is practical. We're already seeing some amazing innovation. We have been a leader on this for decades. We're going to continue to be a leader. But what if Lougheed had gotten up and said, okay, we're going to have bitumen be the major source of our revenue in 5 years? That wouldn't have been realistic. He put out the vision, yes, we are going to make it a major source of our revenue, and we're going to take the time to be able to get there. That's what we're doing. We're setting out where we want to be. We're encouraging all of the different aspects to be able to help us get there. Small modular nuclear, geothermal, lithium, helium. We're supporting carbon capture utilization and storage. We're supporting direct air capture. We're supporting all of these different things, and we will let the industry work on getting us there. But we have to make sure that we are not having an unreal conversation. This conversation has not been realistic for too many years. We are now on the cusp of being realistic, especially since the kind of conversation we're seeing with our trading partners around the world, especially with the reality injection of what happened with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the difficulty that is created in our security, in the markets for energy, with the difficulty that we're seeing with our people who are suffering from an affordability crisis. That's the reality that we have to hit, is that we have to make sure that we're doing all these things together. Yes, we can reach those targets, but we also have to deal with reliability and affordability. We can't have those traded off.
We could go for hours, and some of you probably wish we could. But what is your message then when they say in COP, they're saying we are going to reduce emissions? What is Alberta's message when you go?
Absolutely, and we already have. I mean, my understanding of we've done some modeling with S&P Global to see what the abatement curves might look at. And carbon capture utilization and storage in particular, they think that we can reduce from where we are right now. I think we're about 256 megatons. They think that we can reduce 46 megatons on carbon capture utilization and storage, probably by 2035. Might be 2038 if some of the regulatory issues don't come into alignment. That's pretty good. And then in that period of time, we will see what happens with small modular nuclear. I would hope that we would be able to develop an agreement with Ontario so that we would be able to purchase some of the small modular reactors and help roll them out at the industrial operations that are interested in doing that. Will we be able to do that by 2030? I hope so. And then I'm greatly interested in what happens with direct air capture, because I think that might be what gets us to that last mile. And I should say why I'm so encouraged by that, because when you look at the Haber-Bosch process that was developed, that was some bright chemist saying, gee, how can we take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into fertilizer? They never knew that it would end up resulting in a population boom, that we'd be able to feed the planet. So it's a similar process. We've got really bright minds saying, hey, how do we take that CO2, capture it, and turn it into useful products? Can we turn it into harder cement? Can we turn it into a plastic component so that we can transport hydrogen by pipeline? Can we turn it into, I've seen it turned into rebar. Can you turn it into the blue algae or the blue food coloring that then goes, it's a blue algae which is used as food coloring in Smarties and M&Ms. Like there's all kinds of, my favorite one is, can you capture it and turn it into vodka? So Airco is a stream of alcohol that, or Airco is a product that uses a pure stream of CO2 to create vodka. So I don't know all of the ways in which direct air capture is going to result in us capturing CO2 that can turn into useful things. But what a miracle that we have scientists who are able to do that. Well, because I think that's going to prompt an entire new industry. So I don't want anyone to think that that is somehow not going to be an important part of the solution here. I think it's going to be an essential part of the solution. But it takes time for that to develop. And we need the dream, and I know it's your dream too, is to say we need to attract those scientists, those engineers, those people to Alberta. They need to know that if they're coming here, they're coming to a place that is going to support them in their work and trying to avoid playing that status quo game. Just to excite the folks in the room, they can't wait for the pause to be done. What can people expect from the government come March? Well, we're hoping. I was just meeting with my electricity and affordability and utilities minister, Nathan Nutter. Nate, are you here, Nathan? He's over there. If you guys want to dogpile on him afterwards, but we are committed that this is not a 6-month pause and then, oh, we didn't finish the work, so we're going to do another 6-month pause, and oh, we have more work to do, we're going to do another 6-month pause. His aspiration is that we get all of the pieces in place prior to the 6 months being up so that we can get some certainty into the industry in the early part of next year. But I mean, it should be no secret where we're going. We are going to make sure that we have a good structure in place to incentivize on-site and rooftop solar. So there's no secret there. We are going to look at ways in which we can ensure that when we're putting wind turbines up, that we are protecting the hoary bat and migratory birds, and we have to make sure that we're not putting them in the pathway because we've got huge migratory pathways going down there. We have to make sure that we're not using up prime agriculture land or interfering with neighbors' property rights. And we have to make sure that there's a plan in place for how we incentivize these projects to hook onto existing electrical grid infrastructure so that we're not having to build millions of dollars of new transmission lines. And we have to make sure that there's going to be some logical way of setting money aside so that at the end of life, there's money set aside in order to be able to reclaim. Those are the things we're grappling with now. And so once we've figured out the policy arrangement for that, we'll take the pause off and, let the market prevail.
I appreciate you being here, and I recognize that, as we know, this is not easy conversations, but what gives me great pause or great hope, not pause, wrong word, is the fact that we're all Albertans, and we have to find a way together. And so thanks for coming and being part of this.
My pleasure.
Mr. Chabot said he's not throwing in the towel on C69. He's making amendments, issued policy guidance to his department to proceed with the Environmental Review Act pending these so-called amendments, but did not say when they were coming. Just get my program going here. What are your thoughts?
Well, I hope the federal government doesn't plan on proceeding in a lawless way, because if they're going to defy the Supreme Court, then they're going to be acting in a lawless way. The Supreme Court's been very clear. The federal jurisdiction applies to federal projects on federal land or international. They also made it very clear that the greenhouse gas decision was a very narrow policy decision on a specific instrument, and it does not give them carte blanche to invade our jurisdiction. In fact, they said that cooperative federalism does not mean that one gets to override the other. They said the Constitution matters, the delegation of powers matters, and you have to have a very good reason for arguing why you should be in that jurisdiction. So I would just ask them to obey the law. I would ask them to obey what the Supreme Court said and not to try to play cute with it. The Supreme Court was pretty clear about what their jurisdiction was and what ours is, and I would anticipate that they would bring their laws into alignment with that.
Seems how you and Minister Wilkinson are both in the same room at the same time. Are there any side discussions on how you might be able to keep this out of court?
Well, it's already gone to court. It's gone to the highest court in the land.
Well, he said he didn't want to go back to court.
Well, then they should stay in their jurisdiction and work with us on a 2050 target to be carbon neutral. That's been my position from the first conversation I had with the Prime Minister. I've kept my commitments. We created an emissions reduction and energy development plan. We've worked with them on net zero projects. We have a plan for how we're going to develop out hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, interties, small modular nuclear. Work with us on the things that we have joint interest in, as opposed to trying to continue to invade our jurisdiction. It's very simple.
Are you meeting with them?
Not today, no.
On the same topic, the IEA, obviously it's the IAA, sorry, the interim plan. One of those things is suspending the Environment Minister's authority to force major projects judged on environmental impact. The interim moves they've made today, are they enough as far as you're concerned?
Well, I'll wait and see. I mean, I know that they have certain things that are federal jurisdiction, and I'll just see how they end up proceeding on that. But I was glad to hear that they were suspending his decision-making power. That does show a respect for the process, and I hope that they continue on that vein.
Thanks.
And we'll go to Flat here.
Just a CPP question. Following up on Dean's story from yesterday, what happens now to the bidding panel and the ad campaign that you have with certain numbers touting the numbers that are no longer the numbers that we're hearing? Like,
there's no change in the numbers.
Well, you said yesterday that you would look at refining the numbers before
No.
it went to...
What I've said is we've done our interpretation. We know what the Act says. We've asked the federal government to give us their interpretation. They've declined. We've asked the CPP Investment Board to give us their interpretation. They've declined. So maybe the next step is to go to court to see if the court supports our interpretation. But I think we need to have that number figured out. And whether the federal government comes to the table, the CPP Investment Board does, or the court does, we will have a firm number before we go into a referendum.
Okay, so you're standing by your ad campaign, then putting out these numbers now?
That's what we're entitled to. Okay. If you look at the legislation, the legislation says that a province should be made whole from when they entered the plan. We have overpaid $60 billion. That money has compounded over time. We're entitled to 53%, which is $334 billion. So if they have a different calculation or a different interpretation, we'd love to hear that. And it's up to them to come back to us with that.
Thank you. We'll go to Rick here next.
Following up on the CPP, one of my favorite topics, the CPP and EPP.
Oh, so I've read.
Yeah. Just following that, you say you want a hard number.
Yeah.
And you're willing to negotiate on a hard number.
Well, I want them to tell us
what their numbers are.
If our interpretation's wrong, tell us what they think the right number is. They've declined multiple requests for that.
So are you confident that they will eventually come to that? Like, are you willing to negotiate with them to get to a number different than your number if they come with what they come? Are you willing to sit down with them and talk about numbers if they come with numbers.
I invite them to come with numbers. I invite them to respond to us and tell us what they think the interpretation of the Act is. I invite the CPP Investment Board to do the same. And if they don't, we will go to court, because people need to know exactly what the number would be, and we'll see if the court sides with our interpretation.
But are you willing to, negotiation is all about, as you know, give and take. Are you willing to move off your number if, as part of the
What happens in a negotiation is you put a number down and they put down a counter number. We are still waiting for them to see what they think is wrong with our interpretation of the Act. They have not responded to us.
But are you willing to move off your number?
I'm waiting to see if they're going to respond to us. And if they don't, we'll have to go to court to get a court to tell us what the number is, because Albertans want to know what the number would be. And there's an important reason for that, because the amount of the asset transfer will then determine how much we can reduce premiums, or it will determine how much we can increase benefits. People need to know that before they vote.
The COP28 forum is 5 weeks away. You said previously that you wanted to have a deal in place on carbon capture with the feds for an incentive package. Do you have a deal yet? And if not, why is it delayed?
Well, we know I will be announcing something prior to COP on what our portion would be, but it will have to obviously be contingent on the federal government matching us, because the lion's share of corporate taxes are paid at the federal level. So in order for us to have a program that's going to work for the industry, they have to be in sync with us. So we're working on that. We've told them what our time frame is, and we hope that they come together with something before the end of November.
So to be clear, are you asking them to provide additional funds beyond what they've already announced on the ITC? And how do you get them to come to the table when you're busy attacking them on like multiple other files, and they're busy attacking you on multiple other files?
They have announced an ITC for carbon capture utilization and storage 2.5 years ago, but we haven't seen the architecture around that, what that looks like. So I'm really hoping that they will have that so that we can go together to COP and tell the world that we have 2 levels of government, we're in sync, and this is what the program looks like, and this is how we are compared to the United States. That's what we're working towards. And we have always been able to have good communication with the federal government on the things that we agree on. We signed a $24 billion healthcare deal. They were very helpful during our forest fires and making sure that the Canadian Armed Forces were able to help with our firefighting. So we will work, and we're working together collaboratively on different tables that are coming out of our negotiations. We just disagree with Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault acting like he can make unilateral decisions without discussion, without cooperative federalism in our areas of jurisdiction, and the Supreme Court agrees. They've got to stop doing that. So I hope that they do, and then we'd be able to have a lot more collaboration.
And we've got time for a couple more questions. We'll go to Tim here first.
You say you want discussion, especially when it comes to net zero target. So why is there no meeting that's happening today with Wilkins?
Well, I know that Minister Freeland was in town yesterday and was with my colleague Rebecca Schultz in announcing support for EVER. I believe that Jonathan Wilkinson may have meetings with my energy department officials. So I tend to let my ministers meet with their counterpart. I tend to meet with my counterpart when it's time for us to meet. And so as things are progressing, I'm just letting everybody do their work, finding areas of common ground, and hopefully we'll have a lot more of those.
Thanks, Tim. And we have time for one more question. We'll go to Elise.
Yeah, so Minister Guilbeault today said that it could be months before the adjustments are made to C-69. I'm just wondering if once that's done, if that's insufficient for you, would you consider a formal constitutional challenge to it? Because the feds have been talking, saying, it's just a reference case, and it's clear you two disagree on how to proceed.
Well, I don't know what they're saying, because the process for getting a constitutional decision is that we go to our court and then it gets appealed to the Supreme Court. We did that. We have an answer. It was 5-2. It seems to me the interpretation's pretty clear. So I'm hoping that they follow the law. That's all we're asking for. The Supreme Court has made it pretty clear where their jurisdiction is, where ours is, where the lines are, and has an expectation that cooperative federalism means just that, cooperation, and you cannot use your area of jurisdiction to bludgeon another level of government over the head. So that's my interpretation of the Act, and I hope it's theirs too.
And then just following up on some of the other questions, this $334 billion number for the CPP, Jim Dinning indicated, the number that you start with is maybe your opening position. Do you see the LifeWorks report as an opening negotiating position, or is that the number that you'd like to settle on?
It is the, if you look at the letter of the legislation, we hired actuaries to give us their analysis. That was their analysis. If there is some error that has been made or some additional interpretation or alternative interpretation, obviously we would love to hear that. We've asked the federal government to, through Chrystia Freeland, to give us her interpretation. We've asked the CPP-IB Investment Board as well. And so it's up to them to tell us what they think the alternative definition is. So it's in their court. Happy to have the conversation if they get back to us. If not, we'll probably have to get a legal judgment on it.
Are you surprised at how feisty the debate got in there?
Well, look, I suppose, I mean, I was a bit surprised. I knew coming in here that the Pembina Institute has a particular perspective. Their perspective is that Alberta can be 100% wind and solar and batteries by 2035. And I just can't engage in magical thinking here. I can't pretend that that is achievable when I know it's not. And I try to find common ground. I think that there is a lot of common ground. We agree on net zero by 2050. We agree wind and solar are going to play a part. We agree carbon capture. I don't know if they would agree that carbon capture, utilization, and storage ought to be part of the mix. But those are the kind of things that we need to put on the table if we're going to practically get to the end goal. I think we have to understand that if you try to compress too much into too short a time frame, not only are you not going to achieve your targets, you're going to create a lot of instability, and you're also going to create a lot of additional cost on consumers. And we have to be mindful of all of those things.
Why is one side of that fantasy thinking where then you pivot and you start talking about things like direct air capture, you start talking about CCUS at a rate of effectiveness that doesn't exist right now? Why is one side fantasy thinking when it comes to renewables, but the other side is not?
Well, because we already have carbon capture at scale. It's operating in Boundary Dam at about 65% of being able to sequester emissions. When you talk to those who are in that field, they talk about incremental improvement that can be made, and I'm told that we might be able to get as high as 80%, which I think is fantastic. Direct air capture is already working. Occidental ended up purchasing a carbon engineering, and so they're going to be rolling that out. It's a question of can they roll it out at scale. So I believe in proven technologies. Hydrogen works. I was on a hydrogen bus yesterday. I've driven a hydrogen vehicle. It works. So what we have to do is make sure that things can be rolled out and produced, and then it's a matter of scaling up and being realistic about that. So I have not seen everything that I have seen about wind and solar and batteries and intermittency leads me to believe that we are not going to be able to reach a 2035 target. So that's why we have to work on the things that we know will work.
And that's all the time we have for today. Drew, you can email me your follow-up. I'll get back to you on that. All right. Thank you, everybody.